concept of Western Marxism.
Okay.
So my point of departure is this Anderson quote that you see on the slide. And it goes like this, and this is the crucial thing. Sometimes, so for example, Russell Jacoby, he speaks of Engels as an index for Western Marxism. That is, he decides how a certain type of Marxist relates themselves to Engels, and based on that, you can categorize if somebody is Western Marxist or not. And the quote goes like this: Western Marxism, according to Anderson in this Western Marxism book, was to start with a decisive double rejection of Engels' philosophical heritage by Karl Korsch and Georg Lukács in Marxism and Philosophy and History and Class Consciousness, respectively. Thereafter, aversion to the later text of Engels was to be common to virtually all currents within it, from Sartre to Coletti and Althusser to Marcuse. A single exception to this rule is Sebastiano Timpanaro, who has defended Engels' philosophical legacy with dignity and authority. Okay, so this is the quote, and I take this as my point of departure in problematizing the concept of Western Marxism. So this quote draws attention not only to the moment of inception for Western Marxism, that is the moment within which Western Marxism supposedly emerged, but also to its later genesis and main trajectory, even referencing an exception to its general trend, which is Timpanaro himself. And it is virtually the only person in Anderson's intellectual catalog of thinkers who had something positive to say about Engels. So it is in that regard an exception. Right. So in most abstract terms, we are told that something that was done in the past opened the gates of things to come much later along similar lines. So the Engels, the critique of Engels being that moment of inception or the point of departure. It is what followed after the initial event that turned a prior historical moment into a historical monument. More concretely, the passage suggests that the rejection of Engels' philosophical legacy as a unitary point of reference that sets a normative standard for judging if any pioneering figure in the Marxist intellectual spectrum could be considered a Western Marxist. The nature of this rejection is not specified there, but rather merely singled out as a formal feature shared among the members of Western Marxism. In my reading, the so-called decisive rejection is presumed to be the prime mover that determined much of what followed afterwards in the subsequent generations of what is considered to be Western Marxism. Relatedly, it is in the political and intellectual process of its unfolding that the rejection of Engels' philosophical heritage truly became an ingredient of the ongoing formation of Western Marxism. The link of immediacy that Anderson establishes between the ultimate first cause and its subsequent development displays teleological undertones. For the offspring of the whole tradition is taken to be expressive of a prominent tendency of its ancestry. If this is the case, then one could or should be able to trace the afterlife of Western Marxist provenance back to a primal site in a linear fashion that gave rise to all its succeeding Engels-related constellations. So there's a clear teleological tendency in the Andersonian narrative of Western Marxism that presupposes that there's this kind of pre-established moment of inception that gave rise to the late constellations, which is pretty much the problem, and I try to question whether this can be the case, and if it is, then based on that, can we really speak of the beginning of Western Marxism? So I'm not really problematizing the concept of Western Marxism as such, but rather this point of departure or what Anderson takes this point of a departure to be for Western Marxism. Disappointingly, this narrative that Anderson brings forward points to almost an impossible task, for such an inquiry unexpectedly leads to the conclusion that Western Marxism might have never had a beginning in Anderson's sense of the term. The reason is simple. First, rejection of or aversion to either Engels' philosophy or the idea of natural dialectics in socialist theory did not begin with Korsch or Lukács. It was not an original charge in the early 1920s, as it goes back to the controversies over Engels' philosophical legacy. In the early 19th century, within the circles of the German social democracy, that criticism has been repeatedly voiced in various forms by such eminent figures as Eugen Dürer, Eduard Bernstein, and Karl Kaut. So this is the first problem. We have in total 4 problems in terms of speaking of the moment of inception in Western Marxism, as Anderson theorizes this concept. Right. So the first issue concerns the solidity or consistency of a natural dialectics, and indeed it really goes back to the 19th century reception of Hegel, because Hegel is also a figure that argues for real contradictions and, let's say, the application of dialectics to nature, as it is usually referred to. And within the German social democracy, we have these very prominent figures who also have a distaste for bringing together the conception of dialectics and the natural entities. So, in that regard, we do not have a very original case in the beginning of 1920s. The second problem is this. Second, there is nothing specific to Western about the repudiation of Engels dialectics in one way or another. Chaim Zhitlowski, a Jewish Russian socialist, raised suspicions about the application of philosophical dialectics to natural phenomena by the turn of the century. Remarkably, Zhitlowski was possibly the first, long before Lukács, to shift the greater blame to Engels rather than Marx. The early Soviet theoretical debates between Deborists and mechanists, on the other hand, testify to the fact that the Soviet reception of Engels was far from uniformly positive. To name a further example, Stalin was famously dismissive of Engels' third dialectical law in the negation of negation, though it hardly received full support in the Soviet intellectual spectrum. So, in the second case, I am pointing to this epithet of Westernness in Western Marxism. Now, the one problem in the ordinary debates concerning the Engels problem in Marxism is that people take Lukács' 1923 book, History and Class Consciousness, as the point of departure for Engels and the Western Marxism, the Engels problem in Western Marxism. But you will see that in the earlier Russian receptions, there are different people pointing to the general issue of applying dialectics to nature. What that means, I don't like the epithet, but this is just a short form of referring to the issue at stake. And the kind of issue that Zhitlowski was pointing to, and this is somewhat a forgotten figure in contemporary Marxism, but he played a definite role in the formation of Russian Marxism at the turn of the century, 20th century. He focused on this famous illustration in Marx that you will find in the first volume of Capital, where Marx speaks of the elliptical motion of planets, where he brings up this concept of contradiction and its resolution. Now, Zhitlowski knows this, and he's saying that Marx was wrong to pick up an example from such natural entities as the planetary motion. But he's saying that Engels anti-Düring, and this is the kind of work that was known at the time. This is before 1925. 1925 is the first publication of Dialectics of Nature. And long before Lukács, Zhitlowski was indeed pretty unhappy, more unhappy with Engels than Marx, but also he was saying that Engels is to be blamed more than Marx for bringing together dialectics and nature. Now, the third problem of the conception of Western Marxism in Anderson's sense of the term is that neither Korsch nor Lukács decisively rejected Engels' legacy, politically or philosophically. It is an irony that what Anderson says of both figures uncritically reproduces the charge that was directed against them by their Soviet opponents. Korsch's case, early or late, was certainly a critical appreciation, not a decisive rejection. He was far from a wholesale dismissal of late Engels' philosophical body of work. As for young Lukács, rejection, yes, but not a decisive one. And indeed, this is the wording that you would find in Anderson, decisive rejection, so I'm just breaking this down into components. He was far from a wholesale dismissal of late Engels' philosophical body of work. As for young Lukács, rejection, yes, but not a decisive one. In his 1925-26 defense, sometimes referred to as the Taylorsman dialectic, he first denied having rejected Engels' dialectics, and much later he admitted that he actually did a move which he repeatedly deemed wrong. So this is something that is sometimes mentioned in Lukács research, and this is a bit complicated. So let me focus on Korsch first. And this is indeed the third problem, could be said to be the central problem in Anderson's conception of Western Marxism. And again, keep in mind that I am problematizing the point of departure for Western Marxism as Anderson understands the term, and not Western Marxism as such. That is whether the category could be used fruitfully and so on and so forth. This is not my problem. My problem is whether these people could be understood to be constituting that moment of inception. Now, the kind of logic that Anderson operates with simply reproduces the epithet that was established by the Soviet opponents of Lukács and Korsch. That was then ascribed to Lukács and Korsch, bringing them together, erecting in that regard an image of, let's say, foe. And Korsch has a certain problem because, first of all, he denies that he's that kind of Western Marxist, and he's also consulting someone in that regard to whom I'm going to come. And second, he's saying that this kind of epithet also diminishes his differences to Lukács, but for political reasons, he doesn't want to emphasize those differences that he has intellectually and politically with Lukács. With Lukács himself, sometimes it is forgotten that Lukács' relation to Engels is a bit complicated, and I'm going to unfold this a bit in the fourth problem of Western Marxism, in Anderson's sense of the term. But first of all, he has this problematic footnote that you would find in History and Class Consciousness, where he dismisses Engels for, following supposedly Hegel's mistaken lead, as he calls it, of applying dialectics to nature. And that he received lots of criticisms from people like Devorin in the Soviets. And then he writes this lengthy defense. It is nowadays called Taylorsman dialectic, in which he tries to defend himself, but then turns out that he actually did deny Engels' dialectical legacy in the past, because he was then in 1930s, starting from 1930s, but also especially in 1950s, dismissing his own criticism of Engels. And this is one of the reasons why he was protesting against the reprints of his History and Class Consciousness book, both in German and in other languages, particularly the French edition. And obviously he was pretty much annoyed by his early criticism, to the extent of criticizing himself also in his late work in 1960s, namely Ontology. There you would see that he's embracing Engels and support. So this also brings us to the fourth problem of Western Marxism in this sense of the term. So, fourth, Anderson's framing presumes that hostility towards Engels and the critique of Soviet Marxism go hand in hand. This logic applies neither to Korsch nor to Lukács, as they never instrumentalize the dismissal of Engels' dialectics in their confrontation with Soviet Marxists. This is especially true of Lukács, who was most critical of Engels when he retained his political proximity to the Soviets. The late Lukács, by contrast, embraced Engels' dialectics while dismissing Soviet political rule. Korsch, for his part, developed a critical defense of Engels' dialectics against Lenin and his followers' appropriations. He was also aware of the terminological divide between Western and Soviet Marxism, thanks to a 1927 piece, apparently unknown to Anderson, written by an exiled Russian-Ukrainian Menshevik theoretician, Alexander Shifrin, using the pseudonym Max Werner. Could go to the next slide. Right, so, 1 second. Shifrin provided some political context of the controversy over Korsch and Lukács, as well as that of the debates on dialectics of nature, if not directly on Engels. Yet Korsch distanced himself from Western Marxism, both in Shifrin's sense of the term and as projected by his Soviet opponents. So in this forthcoming issue that we are working on for historical materialism on Western Marxism, we are also going to translate this text that I am referring to by Schifrin, where the term Western Marxism is used for the first time. So in the literature, usually Merleau-Ponty is taken to be either Merleau-Ponty or Korsch. Anyway, so Merleau-Ponty is referring to Korsch, and then Korsch is not the first to use the term. He's taking this from Schifrin, and this doesn't appear to be known to Anderson when he was writing this book on Western Marxism. And the thing is, we have this image of hostility that's directed by the Soviet opponents of Lukács and Korsch, and then this Westernness of Western Marxism is then attached to both figures, and this logic is then reproduced in Anderson, though he seems to be more sympathetic to those that he calls Western Marxists, though the logic belongs to the Soviets, and particularly Deborin and Zinoviev. Right, so I have made this bold. Western Marxism, this is the first occasion that you will see in the literature where the term is used, and he's also making this distinction or contrast between the Russians and the Westerns. So, but he's at the same time reproducing the logic that he finds in the Soviets. The philosophical sociological prerequisites of Western European theoretical Marxism have never had the importance that they received in Soviet Marxism. Likewise, the peculiar universalist ideology of Soviet Marxism is essentially alien to the radical Marxism of the West. And that is quite understandable because it neither had the Enlightenment traditions of Russian Marxism behind it, nor did it claim the increased inevitability of its politics with such ideological expansion, nor did it have to establish a universally binding state ideology. And European communism, insofar as it was capable of theoretical work at all, acquired these characteristics of Western Marxism in the field of theory. Therefore, Soviet Marxist science remained for it only slightly acceptable and even less understandable. So this is a text that was published in the journal Die Gesellschaft, and the title is Soviet Marxism, in which he's trying to make this distinction between the Soviet tradition and what is not Soviet. So yeah, this Westernness is somewhat equated with non-Soviet. So it is an interesting binary logic that he entertains, and he owes pretty much to the Soviets in inventing this term. So these four difficulties imply that if there was a beginning of Western Marxism at all, it must be conceptualized differently. So this is my conclusion. So I'm not saying that Western Marxism is a bad term and we should drop it, but we have a serious issue in speaking of a beginning of Western Marxism, and this is pretty much the claim that Anderson comes forward with. If you could go back to the previous slide. Right, so Anderson is saying Western Marxism was to start with the decisive double rejection, so this is the problem. I am questioning whether we could really speak of a beginning of Western Marxism if we have these four problems that are very difficult to solve. So when highlighting the Engels problem in the East-West line, Anderson appears to take his cue from one particular figure in the scale of Western Marxism, namely Herbert Marcuse. For Marcuse, more than anyone else, displayed a remarkable hostility towards Engels, treated him as a factor of contamination both in Marxist theory and practice, and held him responsible for what he thought to be the most counterfeit version of socialism, namely Soviet Marxism. It seems to be primarily Marcuse's angle from which Anderson issues the beginning of Western Marxism. Yet the two first-generation Western Marxists do not really fall under that domain. One must therefore rethink the connection between its origin and afterlife. So maybe one last point about this. Of course, the conjuncture today is different than when Anderson was writing this book, and another issue is Anderson never edited the book or didn't rewrite any sections, right? And now, from the perspective of today, it is a bit, of course, weird that we also have this entire intellectual tradition of post-colonial studies and so on. And Anderson could be said to be reproducing this old divide between East and West. And indeed, you have to keep in mind that when I am dealing with the old Marxist traditions, I am also speaking from a particular personal background. Now, And I'm going to finish with that, with one or two personal notes. I am based in China, but I am originally from Turkey. Now, if you are in China, the entire world looks west, except for Japan. The second note is, and this is a long time ago, I was living on the, I am from Istanbul, and I was living on the Asian side, and my school was on the European side. I was taking the ferry going to the west, to Europe, and then in the evening I was coming back to Asia. So I could be a Western Marxist in the morning and then Western Marxist in the night. I am saying this for this particular reason. When people speak of this West and Westerners, this Turkish experience in my head, I have certain difficulties applying that to my own reality as I have experienced it. Perhaps not so relevant note, but this Westerners is also in this particular Turkish context, but also in Japan, for example, has some other political connotations, such as West being modern and that you would identify with progress, while East is backward and so on and so forth. So it is in that regard a multiplicity of problems that we have to do, both theoretically, but also on the level of personal experience. Good. So this is pretty much it, and I can also unfold a couple of issues if there are any questions. So thank you very much for
Darren, would you allow me 1 minute, because I'm so afraid my English is so poor that I will distribute right now a couple of presentations, so they can